on the sort of the long-range missile use, it may not be that it's announced this week, but I think that if Starmer is able to point to the fact that it was discussed, he'll probably try and present that as a win. We have the UN General Assembly coming up later in September, and so it may be sort of work that's done in advance in the run-up to that.
Sir Keir Starmer has dismissed warnings from Vladimir Putin that the US and the UK would be at war with Russia if they strike a deal to allow Ukraine to use long-range missiles to hit Russian targets. The Prime Minister's in Washington, D.C., where he'll meet the US President Joe Biden later. Here's Larisa Brown, the Times defence editor.
Keir Starmer will be meeting with Joe Biden in the White House, where they're going to be discussing whether or not to allow Ukraine to use long-range weapons such as the British-made Storm Shadow missile against targets inside Russia. At the moment, the Ukrainians are restricted as to where they can use these weapons because of fears of escalation in the West. Although the UK wants to relax the rules along with France, we're told, President Biden still remains to be convinced. I was speaking to a couple of sources yesterday who told me Biden could end up allowing Ukraine to fire the British-made weapons inside Russia, but not give the green light to use the longer-range American ones. It's all pretty sensitive, but basically the Ukrainians have to have the US go ahead if they're going to use any of the weapons inside Russia, mainly for targeting reasons. As Starmer flew to Washington, Vladimir Putin warned the West about going ahead with the move, saying it would mean NATO is at war with Russia.
That's Larisa Brown, who's the Times defence editor. Let's speak now to Ali Renison, a former trade advisor to the UK government, former head of trade and EU policy at the Institute of Directors, and now a director at SEC Newgate. Ali, good morning.
Morning.
What does a successful visit to the US look like then for Sir Keir Starmer? Is there a chance here that the build-up, the week that has been, suggests there will be a decision on Storm Shadow missiles, and so if there isn't an outcome, actually that's a disappointment and a letdown?
I think it depends. I mean, obviously, there's a range of things they want to discuss. This is principally a foreign policy visit in the first instance. They're going to talk about Ukraine. They're going to talk about sort of Gaza. They're also going to talk about sort of economic sort of supply chains. There was a recent agreement that was actually struck this week between the UK, the US, and Australia on supply chain resilience cooperation. So I'm sure that the Prime Minister will be sort of tempted to point to that as evidence of sort of things are moving. But specifically on the sort of the long-range missile use, it may not be that it's announced this week. But I think that if Starmer is able to point to the fact that it was discussed, he'll probably try and present that as a win. We have the UN General Assembly coming up later in September, and so it may be sort of work that's done in advance in the run-up to that. You have to remember also that the reason that this is a huge issue, because this issue of whether sort of to have backing for the enabling of at least British and Western-made sort of long-range missiles to be used in Russia, is because in recent weeks, Iran has had a huge, massive transfer of its own ballistic missiles to Russia. So that's the kind of context for all of this and why the US is becoming a little bit more minded to sort of at least encourage and allow its sort of its allies to use its own missiles inside Russia.
Is it fair to describe the context for this as being somewhat delicate? Here we are just a few weeks away from the presidential election, and so sort of engaging with the White House on such important policy is somewhat precarious in some ways.
I think that if we had a visit to Kamala Harris, there was a bit of toing and froing about whether Starmer was going to be able to meet with Harris and by extension, her opposite number, Trump. That would have been particularly delicate. I think, this is the second meeting that Starmer has had with Biden since the election. It's sort of part of the whole, we're trying to reset our relationships with this sort of our allies, etc. So I think it's not so delicate in the fact that he is engaging on a sort of long-running sort of consensus issue, at least here in the UK, about sort of support for Ukraine. We know that Donald Trump is potentially wanting to certainly sort of take a downward trend towards aid. We don't know what his actual position is on military support in this instance.
Okay. When it comes to a meeting like this with Biden, where there is a presidential election on the not distant horizon, things could look very different in the White House beyond November should Donald Trump go on to win. And what you're talking about there, kind of resetting the relationship, working on trade. What else kind of emerges from meetings like today? What is there an argument to suggest that actually Joe Biden is kind of the wrong person to be having these sorts of conversations with, given that he will sort of disappear into the mists of history in but a few weeks' time?
Well, I think it depends on the outcome of the presidential election. If you get Kamala Harris, it's very much continuity. And I think sort of Trump actually presents an interestingly different approach to trade in the sense that he's always said that he wants sort of a trade deal with the UK. It's been primed that potentially he sort of, if he becomes president again, he offers it up as an exchange for basically exempting the UK somehow from his increased across the board tariff proposals that he's been talking about. I mean, I think that in terms of sort of seeing a president, a US president, there's probably actually not a great deal certainly wrong with that. I think it would be more of an issue if in effect Kamala Harris and only Kamala Harris was part of that kind of meeting with Biden this side of the election.
Yeah. What else then is up for grabs here? What about the idea that Kamala Harris was going to meet Keir Starmer during his visit? That's the one that's been kind of floating around for a couple of days. It does seem to have gone away now, but I'm just wondering if there's anything to sort of read into that, Ali.
Well, again, it's a bit of a sort of, I wouldn't say an awkward, but a delicate situation for sort of Starmer and certainly UK government officials to have to maneuver around, because obviously on the one hand, she is the vice president. There is absolutely nothing wrong on paper with the vice president meeting with the UK prime minister as part of his meeting with his opposite number in Washington. On the other hand, she is a presidential candidate. And so I think the reality is that what we're hearing is that potentially a meeting is being lined up for a meeting with Harris in the margins or of the UN General Assembly later this month.
Thank you very much indeed, Ali. Very good to speak to you this morning. We're grateful for your time. That's Ali Renison, former trade advisor to the UK government, former head of trade and EU policy at the Institute of Directors, currently director at SEC Newgate. What does a good meeting with President Biden look like for Sir Keir Starmer today? One where Joe Biden remembers who he is, perhaps, where he remains compos mentis. I'm not saying that to be mean. That is actually just, an objective, an ambition for any sort of consultation in the Oval Office nowadays, isn't it? That you can walk away and say, we were able to have a kind of good conversation. It was constructive, and here's one or two things that can emerge from it.
Well, it's interesting thinking about the last time that these two met. That was kind of one of the flashpoints where people were concerned about Biden's fitness to run again, because people were very concerned about his interaction with Keir Starmer and observations that were made. And Keir Starmer was pressed on how he found Biden. In a way, it'll be a lot easier for Keir Starmer to be much more honest about that this time round.
There's also a political strategy bit, isn't there? Because if Joe Biden, as he does, believes that Kamala Harris will win and become president in January, but wins the election in November, a lot of what he does now is about laying groundwork for her to inherit, as it were, and to take on. And so lots of the kind of decision-making and considerations will be with that in mind. For example, if there's something he can delay making a decision on now so that she can declare something of an early victory and make that declaration instead, then that does feed into kind of White House policymaking at this point. I'm not sure if the war in Ukraine would fit into that category, given its kind of urgency. Delaying things for political gain for several months might not quite land as well. But it's something in a kind of wider policy consideration that he might park things so that Kamala Harris can do them herself.